Welcome to the Arrested Lawyers Initiative. My name is Stephen Delahunty, and today I'm going to be chatting with the founder and chief executive of Trial International, Philip Grant. Philip, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, can you start just by telling us a bit about yourself and about Trial International?
All right, I'm a Geneva-based human rights lawyer. I've been active in a number of organizations since I was a teenager, working on human rights issues. I did a PhD in constitutional law, then went to the bar here in Geneva for about a decade. And during that time, I also started and launched Trial International, which is an NGO working on impunity issues, working alongside victims of international crimes, trying to obtain justice, truth, reparations for the crimes they endured. Trial International is one of the few organizations currently active on these topics, working alongside a number of victims in countries where the crimes were perpetrated. So we have offices and programs, for example, in the DRC, in Nepal, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, but also using legal principles in countries such as Switzerland or other European countries, trying to arrest perpetrators who might be residing or passing through these countries and bringing them to court for the abuses they have committed in their own countries.
And I mean, as a founder, did you see, before you founded the organization, did you see that maybe there was a gap in, for the sort of work you're doing, that there wasn't enough organizations doing this sort of work? Is that?
Exactly, yeah. Trial was founded in 2002. It was not long after the arrest of Augusto Pinochet. You might remember in October 1998, the former dictator of Chile was arrested based on a Spanish arrest warrant when he was in London undergoing health treatment. And at that time, some of us working in the fields of human rights were just saying, wow, this is an immensely important precedent, and maybe we should go back to our law books and try to see what is possible at the local level, at the national level. Switzerland in particular being a place where so many people come for international conferences, for tourism, to see their doctor or their bankers, blah, blah, blah. We thought it was a good country to start with. And we did have at the time examples of individuals, of victims of crimes actually bumping into their perpetrator, into their abuser on the street of Geneva or elsewhere. So that prompted a few of us to try to organize a movement, essentially a legal movement, to try to bring those cases to justice. It didn't go very smoothly to start with. You have to convince quite a lot of people, including prosecutors, who probably don't even know where the country you're talking about is on the map, and they have to redo their whole thinking about what it means to investigate a case. But eventually, after some years, we did manage to bring a certain number of cases to justice. Some went to court, some are currently being investigated. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that later on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear about some of your more recent cases. But I think to start, just for anyone that may not understand what it is, could you explain the principle of universal jurisdiction?
Okay, so universal jurisdiction is a legal principle grounded in international law. It derives from various international conventions. And basically, it allows, and at some point even obliges states to exercise their criminal jurisdiction over a perpetrator who might have committed crimes abroad against foreign victims, and even if the perpetrator doesn't even have the nationality of the state that is exercising jurisdiction. So basically it means there's a series of crimes that are so abhorrent, so grave, that the international community as a whole can exercise jurisdiction over them. What is it? Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, torture, and forced disappearances. Basically those very, very gravest of all human rights violations.
And I mean, it sounds like, what are the challenges with that? Because I imagine you would get maybe pushback, from governments or from, not judicial systems in the country where the crimes took place. What are the challenges in implementing that and enforcing it?
Okay, to be honest, there's a huge number of
yeah.
It's not an easy task. I think the first thing to understand is that it's a legal setting, right? There are some rules that apply, and of course, I mean, just to start with the basically obvious things, a fair trial must be guaranteed to the suspected perpetrators. The second issue is that states exercising universal jurisdiction have to respect immunities. There are a certain number of people that under international law cannot be prosecuted by a foreign country. Basically, a head of state, a sitting head of state, a prime minister, a minister of foreign affairs, those important people who represent their state abroad cannot be prosecuted under, even if they have committed genocide. Okay, we need to be clear about that. There's no possibility to go after a sitting president. Once the person leaves office, it is possible. And there are some precedents. Hissène Habré was a former dictator of Chad. He was sentenced in Senegal to life in prison. He had left office and was picked up in Senegal and eventually brought to court. So you have these issues of some people are immune from prosecution. And for those who could be subjected to prosecution abroad, you have very practical difficulties. For the investigating or prosecuting authorities, basically accessing the crime scene. If you are investigating a crime committed by a current regime, you will not get cooperation from them. So you would have to rely on evidence, on testimonies that are outside of the country where the crimes were committed. You would need to talk to insiders, to talk to experts, talk to victims, witnesses who are outside of the country. Of course, for someone bringing a case for a particular victim, another big issue is security. I mean, the risk involved for yourself or your relatives who might still be in the country where the regime in question is still operating. The time that elapses between the crimes and the moment when the investigation or the prosecution takes place is often a big challenge. Some of the cases that we still see going to court today relate to the Rwandan genocide, to what happened in 1994 in Rwanda against the Tutsi minorities. That was, what, 27 years ago. So another big issue is the passing of time. The cases that are currently ongoing in France, for example, relate to the genocide against the Tutsi committed in Rwanda in 1994. So that's something like 27 years ago. Of course, with such a passing of time, well, sometimes the perpetrators die. Sometimes the witnesses or the victims are not there anymore to testify in court. And memory fades also. I mean, testimonies who rely on accuracy sometimes are difficult to obtain when there's so much that has happened since the crimes were committed. So yeah, time is really one of those issues also that are very important. And then you have all the obstacles linked to the willingness of the state to prosecute. It's always easier, of course, to go after small fishes from a small country with whom you don't have any particular ties. It's much more difficult to go after the big guys from a powerful state. That's why also you don't see maybe a lot of prosecutions or investigations of crimes committed by the US or by Israel or by China or Russia or other powerful states. So there's a number of legal issues involved, some obstacles, and very practical issues. And on the practical side, I would also add the difficulty. I mean, the sheer difficulty of investigating sometimes mass crimes committed abroad, and the resources and the expertise that prosecutors and investigators need to have to carry out their work correctly.
Because it sounds to me, I currently write about the international aid sector a lot at the moment, and it's sadly you hear a lot about maybe crimes committed by United Nations soldiers abroad, or aid workers abusing the position in the country that they're working in, and part of the reason why there's a lot of difficulty in prosecuting and following on these crimes is because no one's willing to take responsibility for the jurisdiction. Is it the home country where the person came from? Is it within country? And there's a debate in the UK at the moment now about whether the aid sector needs its own sort of regulator that has the power to follow up on this. But it seems like what you're talking about could be useful in those sorts of settings as well. I don't know if
it could be. Universal jurisdiction helps indeed to fill a gap. Generally, the state where the crimes were committed should be the one handling those cases. But most of the time, impunity reigns. The regime in place has no willingness whatsoever to prosecute its own members.
Yeah.
So what is left? You might have an international court who could intervene. That's really for a limited number of cases, for those who bear the highest responsibility, but also for the countries who might have ratified in relation to the International Criminal Court, for example. So a lot of situations will never be covered by an international court. So what do you have left in those circumstances? Not much, apart from third-party states who have no special relationship to the crime scene, but happen at some point to have the perpetrator coming, for example, on vacation or resettling on their territory. And there you're faced with the question of, why us? Or why do we have to investigate? I mean, what's the reason behind it? The reason is clear. There are international laws that are in place precisely to go after those people. That's why the system was initially set up. So prosecutors and investigators have to do their job. Easier said than done. Sometimes you have diplomatic pressure. Sometimes you have political pushback. Sometimes you just don't have the resources, the human or the financial resources. And sometimes you lack the cooperation from the country where the crimes were committed. So yes, in theory, it should be there to fill a gap. In practice, it's getting better. You have more and more states intervening. 10 years ago, it would have been like a rough ride. Today, you probably have 20, 25 countries that are actively investigating universal jurisdiction cases.
I was going to say, so is this, it's something that countries have to adopt? Do they have to ratify this principle in law before they can start investigating?
The principle is grounded in various conventions. It could be the Geneva Conventions, which almost all states have ratified. It could be the Torture Convention, the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances. There's a number of legal instruments that more or less every state has ratified, one or most of them. So the root is there. Now something needs to grow out of it, and that's where states need to adopt national legislation that gives them jurisdiction over those crimes. Amnesty International in 2012, I think, issued a report stating that approximately over 160 countries had, in one way or the other, implemented the principle of universal jurisdiction. So it is in most of the books of most of the countries in the world. The question is, how do you then exercise it? You need to have, and that is something that has proved very efficient, specialized war crimes unit, people who know how to deal with these cases, people who are dedicated. It might be investigators, it might be prosecutors. It should be also people from the immigration services who can pick up, files from asylum seekers who might have attested to having been party to crimes, who can also relate to victims who have given their testimonies about what they have suffered, and bringing all this together within specialized units, sufficiently staffed and well-resourced. That makes a difference. We're seeing in a number of countries, well, essentially, you have to admit that, Western European countries, but also in Argentina, in Senegal, in other places around the world, that such a creation of specialized units does bring results. Today, I mean, the numbers are never fully clear because a lot of these investigations are still secret. But last year, our reports showed that at least 140 plus cases were being investigated by those various investigators and prosecutors, a number of them being brought to court. But there's probably hundreds of them that we don't know about, that are at preliminary stages. And what we're seeing is that those countries with war crimes units, the Germans, the French, the Swedes, the Dutch, they are doing very, very highly efficient job. And we'll see more and more cases going to court in those countries.
And I mean, for victims then, is it about, because, often it will be could be dangerous for someone to come forward and report a crime, you know, in the country where it happened for, you know, a whole host of reasons. But is for victims then, is this about offering another chance or another pathway to some sort of justice and retribution from what happened?
The process should be, in theory, it should be victim-led. In practice, it's always a little bit more complicated than that. There are a number of balancing issues at stake.
Could you give us an example? Is there any case you're working on at the moment that maybe you could sort of talk about?
I mean, you could take cases, and maybe I'll try to illustrate that later on. You could take cases where a particular victim might want to bring a case forward, but for a situation of mass crimes, because that victim might have fled abroad, his family or her family might be safely, you know, relocated elsewhere, but the investigation might jeopardize other people in the country in question. And we've been working on Syria for a number of years, and you do see Syrian refugees abroad trying to access justice and to bring cases against a number of Syrian perpetrators. Always in the background is the question of who's at home still, who could be targeted by the regime if it came that such and such person was bringing a complaint forward. So it's never, you know, clear cut, especially when the regime that committed the crime is still in place.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you sort of mentioned it before, but why do you think some countries apply it more effectively than others?
You know, to some extent, it's a question of size. Big countries that can put aside resources at the national level are a bit more efficient than smaller countries. Here in Switzerland, small country, there's you know, part-time prosecutors working on these cases. If you take Germany or France, you have dozens of investigators and prosecutors active at the same time. So it's a lot of question of willingness from the part of the state to invest into these war crimes unit, to give them the necessary means to act. It's also the question of whether the laws are up to date and allow for such cases to go forward. You also sometimes have, you know, questions in the background of retroactivity of the law. Can you apply the law that is recently adopted to a situation that might have happened 15 years ago? So the courts are also developing jurisprudence and precedents on these questions. Yeah, I think the question of political willingness and of the means allocated to prosecutors and investigators play a big role.
Is there as well, how much does sort of international politics play into it? Because, you know, a lot of, as a very generalization, but criticism of, say, the International Criminal Court in the past is that it's been too focused on, say, you know, the African continent and the Middle East. Does that play into your work? Do you have to navigate that at times, you know?
Yeah, I think there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to your question. You would have to go
not enough time in the day.
But yeah, I mean, take the biggest case that ever went to court, the Hissène Habré case. Former president of Chad had to flee, resettled in Senegal, and you know, 15 years of advocacy from human rights organizations in the end made it possible for the trial to take place over there, and eventually Hissène Habré was sentenced to life in prison. But in the preparation to the case, politics was always there. I mean, how do you mobilize resources for such a huge case having to take place in Senegal? There had to be international backing from sponsors to organize the trial. There had to be a court case by Belgium who took Senegal to the International Court of Justice to push Senegal to investigate and eventually prosecute Hissène Habré because Senegal was not doing its job correctly. Only after the verdict was rendered by the International Court of Justice did the case really go ahead. So yeah, you have politics, diplomacy, a bit of legal wranglings always behind the scene. Now, if you take other countries, in principle, at least here in most Western European countries, there's a strict separation between the politics and the judicial. That's the principle. In reality, yeah, we do see some interventions. We do see some politicians being, a bit nervous about some of these cases going ahead. But I think what you mostly see is some sort of, I don't know if you say that in English, auto-censorship from the part of prosecutors. I mean, imagine bringing a case against a high-ranking US military or a high-ranking Israeli military. You know that if you move ahead, it's going to unleash, hell for you as a prosecutor. Everybody will be on your back. Yeah. So I'm not saying these are not professional people, but I'm pretty sure. I mean that plays into their mind. Yeah. To take into account the fact that it's not a neutral territory. It can be a battleground for proxies in the international.
In the international system. Can you say how many cases do you have, the active cases you're working on at the moment?
Depends what you mean by working on. The cases that are already filed and investigated at the national level. So we have a number. Okay, I cannot talk to you very frankly about these cases. Yeah. But there's about 8 or 9 that are currently, well, maybe even a little bit more than that in the pipeline before Swiss, French, and other countries. Okay, I'll be a bit secretive here. I can't tell you much more. But there's a number of other cases that we are investigating that are, prosecution level, where we're still investigating. We're still constructing the case file that would at some point be submitted. And then there are the cases that we have already filed and that are public. Just to give you one example, here in Switzerland, there's a former minister of the interior of Gambia, the right-hand man of a former dictator, Yahya Jammeh, in the Gambia. His name is Ousmane Sonko, was arrested in 2017 and is currently awaiting a trial in a cell here in Bern. So that's, for us, a pretty high-level suspect, a former minister of the interior. That's as close to the top that you can get. And then there are investigations ongoing, criminal investigations for war crimes ongoing against the former Minister of Defense of Algeria, Khaled Nezzar, who led the military junta back in the 1990s in Algeria. That case has been ongoing for quite a long time. He's not arrested, but he's under criminal investigation. There's a big case ongoing against the uncle of Bashar al-Assad, Rifat al-Assad, who was the brother of the former president Hafez al-Assad, who is suspected by a lot of people of being the butcher of Hama. He was in charge of military units who took back the city of Hama in 1982, where probably tens of thousands of people were victims of atrocities, from torture to rape to executions and disappearances. So those are like the highest profile cases that we have, and then we have a number of maybe lower level people.
Yeah, I suppose I have to ask, should be interested in how difficult has it been, pursuing these cases and doing this sort of work over the last 12, 15 months while everyone's been dealing with the pandemic in different ways. It must have made your job a bit more difficult than normal.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit particular. Most of the time for these cases, we have our team of investigators and lawyers going on the ground when it's possible to meet with the victims, with the experts, with insiders, with a number of people who might have something to say about the case. In the Rifat al-Assad case, we traveled all over the region. We went to numerous countries where refugees had resettled to undertake interviews. Of course, during the past 15 months, that has been impossible to do, at least physically, but you can still talk, you can still gather testimonies and talk to people and do a lot of open source investigation online or through other means. So it did not stop the work, but it kind of, put a some additional hurdles along the way. Not clear yet when we'll be fully able to resume the investigations, but yeah, at some point they will.
Have you, because your organisation's been going for nearly 20 years now, have you seen sort of a shift maybe in awareness or in, organisations' willingness to use this principle? Are there any trends you can talk about that you've noticed in the course of that time?
I mean, for me, there's a clear trend in this way that, I mean, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. Universal jurisdiction 20 years ago, after the Pinochet precedent, there were huge changes in some countries in their laws, in Spain, in Belgium in particular, and everybody thought at the time that this was the principle that we were all hoping for. Pinochet had opened a door, and we could go after George W. Bush, we could go after Rafsanjani, we could go after whoever, name it, it could be done. And that's actually what happened. Numerous criminal complaints were filed in Belgium that really flooded the system and made it impossible for the judiciary to work their way through. So there was a bit of political backlash, and after a few years, it all kind of fell apart. Laws were scaled down, possibilities to bring complaints were restricted, and for a number of years, it was very complicated, sometimes impossible to bring these cases forward. And then I think less than 10 years ago, and I think a lot has to do also with the arrival of a lot of refugees from Syria in Europe, states started to rethink a little bit their position. When hundreds of thousands of refugees came into Europe, you had, of course, numerous victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria that just came, to your country, and that does bring change about perception of what you can do justice-wise. But also along the way came some perpetrators who relocated in these countries, and you had a lot in France. You had a massive amount, very, very important amount of people in Germany or in Sweden. And for prosecutors and police investigators, I mean, that's their job. That's what they're there to do. So we've seen a shift in the past years on the question of whether more resources should be made available for these investigations to go on. And I think now the trend is less going after, the George Bushes of this world, or the really powerful guys that you'll probably never get anyway, and more on constructing reasonable cases that can go to court, that can really deliver justice. I'm not saying that you're not going to get high-level military guys or high-level politicians, but the expectations are a little bit lower to make it more realistic.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a good way for me to go into my last question, was that if you are an NGO or you're a lawyer who has maybe begun down the road of bringing one of these cases to court or is investigating them, can you give some advice for how you effectively maybe bring a case to court under universal jurisdiction?
Yeah, I think my first advice would be to be patient.
Yeah.
Most cases can take a lot of time.
Is it possible to say an average? Is that hard to say? How long?
There's no average.
How long a piece of string?
I mean, some countries are pretty effective. They have rules on how long you can keep someone in pretrial detention, and the cases need to go ahead quickly. There should be one in Sweden in August, if I'm not wrong, against an Iranian perpetrator, someone who's suspected to have taken part in the 1988 prison massacres. He was arrested in November 2019, and about a year and a half after his arrest, the trial should start. That, by many standards, is super fast. You've had cases ongoing in France for decades on Rwandan suspects. They haven't been in pretrial detention for decades, of course, but the investigations have taken so long. So I don't think you can just do an average and say it will last about 6 years. It depends on each situation, but patience is warranted most of the time. Mm-hmm. The second thing, if you're talking about individual lawyers, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. And if you make a living out of your job as a lawyer, it might be complicated to hold on to those cases for a lot of time. That's why I think NGOs are very important. There should be an increasing networking between NGOs and lawyers. We have seen that, and you know, we work with outside lawyers on specific cases. But I think those who have the most prospect of going ahead are, if not led, at least supported by NGOs who can have maybe a longer perspective, who can maybe dedicate some resources that lawyers.
I was going to say, is that a funding as well as a resources issue? Is that so you can work together?
Yes, I mean that the resources are usually important, but also just in terms of the technicity or your expertise. I don't think lawyers basically go out in the field to investigate. I mean, you need to have a methodology. It's not necessarily your role as a lawyer to investigate. So I think people need to come together and try to see country by country what's the best way, how to be more effective. I personally see more the lawyers as being there to defend and represent victims, be able to go to court, and the NGOs as playing a more traditional role of investigating. But it depends from country to country. But clearly there needs to be more exchange. I think from the lawyer side, there's a lot of expertise to be gained in this field, and I would just counsel lawyers, for example, to go to our website and read our briefing material. We have a lot of information about how UJ, universal jurisdiction, works in Canada, in Sweden, in Switzerland, in France, in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. We have those briefing papers out there, so get used to it, understand how the system functions, and then when victims approach you as a lawyer to represent them, I think you will also always find an ally in the NGO community. There's not many of us out there. Huh? There's a limited number of organizations doing a great work, but I think partnering is important because you have to brace yourself for a long ride.
Oh, thanks, Philip. I feel like that's a nice place to end the discussion. It's been really fascinating. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you again for having me.